The Spinoff Podcast Network.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank. The bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi making Kiwi better off.
Kia ora tātou. Welcome to a special crossover mashup edition of Gone When by the Lunch Facts Time Change with me, Toby Manhire. And from Wellington, Bernard Hickey. Kia ora, Bernard.
Kia ora.
You have emerged, I suppose now, a couple of hours ago as we speak at 4 o'clock on Budget Day, May 22, from the lockup. You were in the lockup today. What was the mood in the lockup?
It was quite subdued. It's one of those meh type budgets where there's not a lot of big new spending measures. There's lots of little nips and tucks, and the tone of the description of it by Nicola Willis in her speech and in the Q&A during the lockup was very much, we're the responsible economic managers. We're going to do the right thing by the budget. We're going to restrict our spending and we're going to restrict our debt, and it's all about going for economic growth. And it's all very much we're tightening our belts, you should tighten yours too. And there's some sausage rolls at the back, but not much more than that.
Let's cast our minds back a few weeks when we all learned about the changes to the pay equity scheme, which involved chucking 33 applications back to the starters line, tightening some of the criteria, and that was all introduced under urgency. There was some different perspectives given on what was driving that decision, that quite big change. One of the commentators, a man called David Seymour, said of Brooke van Velden, the minister in charge, that she had saved the budget, I beg your pardon, for the government. Is that borne out today? Is that accounts for a large part of the savings that have been found, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So we got confirmation today that of the $5.3 billion worth of cost savings that the government has found for itself over the next 4 years, $2.7 billion a year of that comes from the pay equity trashing. And that really says we are paying for tax cuts, we are paying for a new investment boost tax cut to encourage investment by businesses. We're paying for that mostly, 51%, by trashing these pay equity payments that might have been made by the government over the next 4 years and which now can't because the government's legislated retrospectively under urgency those payments out of existence.
The growth goal is enormous, though, isn't it? It was right at the start of the year. It was staked out very clearly. This is the year of growth. This is the growth budget. Christopher Luxon has said, I'm going to say growth a lot, and he has done. And so within this budget, that investment boost announcement, as you put it, which is key to this, and Treasury says it will generate some growth. Just quickly explain in layman's terms what that is. It relates to an immediate depreciation of 20% on technology and machinery, stuff that's bought to try and drive productivity and growth at once. Explain what that means in layman's terms, layperson's terms, and then what impact that's likely to have on growth.
So let's say, for example, the Spinoff decided it wanted to start a new farm. It could buy a tractor for $1 million. New farm, yep. A tractor. Okay. The Spinoff needs a tractor. $1 million for the tractor. Well, the Spinoff could then reduce its reported revenues for that year by 20% of the $1 million tractor. So let's say the Spinoff has revenues each year of $100 million. I'm really hoping that's the number. And,
something like that.
Yeah. Yep. And then you could take 20% of the cost of the tractor off your revenues, and that will reduce your tax by a bit. And collectively, the government is saying that will reduce the government's tax revenues by $1.7 billion per year over the next 4 years. Treasury says in the first couple of years, because this will be very much front-loaded, the first couple of years, this will boost GDP by 0.4% per annum per year. And then the benefits of that start to dribble away over the following years, because the upfront nature of this tax break means it really is the next couple of years when the effects will be felt. But the long-term effects, according to Treasury, are that this will increase the investment stock of businesses by a total of 1.5% over 20 years, and will increase GDP in total over 20 years by 1 percentage point. So these are not huge numbers. We're talking here about a government which needs to really increase investment to improve productivity and to improve economic growth. And it has come up with 0.4 percentage points of GDP growth over the next couple of years. That's not going to be enough to rescue it, in my view, from a double-dip recession. Because even though, as you said, Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis have both said growth a lot this year. In fact, if you had $1 for every time they said growth, then we would have had an awful lot of growth. But actually, when you look at the budget figures, you can see that the so-called fiscal impulse, the amount of extra oomph in or sucking out from the government into the economy, is a collective sucking out contraction of 3 percentage points of GDP over the next 4 years. So what the government is saying here is that we as the government are pulling back from the economy. We're going to reduce the size of government from around 34% of GDP to around 30% of GDP. We're going to suck that out, and we want someone else to step forward, be it businesses, and that's where the investment boost idea comes from, or households in the form of borrowing more to buy each other's houses or maybe build some new houses. The trouble is, for the government, that's not happening. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. In particular, households don't want to buy the next door neighbour's house because the next door neighbour doesn't want to sell it to them for a price they believe is below where it should be, because we've had this 20% fall in house prices and a lot of people are not forced to sell, and so they're just going to wait. And so we've got this big Mexican standoff, a freeze in the market right now. And of course the banks too, they've had their capital requirements increased by Adrian Orr, and they haven't been reversed yet. And the DTIs and the LVR restrictions on first home buyers and investors mean we are not seeing the housing market with bits tacked on really starting to rev up and solve Nicola Willis's problems. And that's where I think this budget doesn't solve her problems. It isn't a growth budget and risks driving the economy into a double-dip recession later this year. And we're already seeing that with some of the numbers coming through.
It is, though, just to stay on this investment boost for a moment, something that a lot of people in manufacturing and technology in a range of areas, not you give a farm example, have been crying out for years, though, isn't it? And it's not a crude company tax break, which some had been sort of talking about, in recent years. And it will, the idea is incentivize these companies to make investments in shifts that will affect productivity, because that's the real problem we've had, isn't it, over so many years, is that New Zealand has just been stuck on its productivity and then been driven towards a lower wage economy and so on and so forth.
Yes, I mean, it is a good way to encourage investment. For example, you can't just buy land and you can't buy something that's already here in New Zealand. So let's say if we wanted to buy a second-hand tractor or we just wanted to buy a section next door to the Spinoff studios, and secretly we're doing it to speculate on land prices, we're not allowed to do that using this system. So it has been structured reasonably cleverly. The problem here, though, is it doesn't change the underlying incentives in the economy for anyone who has some spare money. So that's businesses and for households. So at the moment, if I get some spare money, if I have a choice, do I put it into residential land, which I can gear up with loans from a bank, and I can make tax-free capital gains on that leveraged investment. And I'm so sure of this, and the risks are so low, and if you look over the last 20 or 30 years, massively outperforming any other investment choice, that fundamental investment driver, that imbalance in the choices that savers have to put their money is still very much there. And the numbers are extraordinary compared to the $1.7 billion the government's talking about here. So it's what I call a performative policy change. It looks like something's happening, but actually compared to the current problems isn't fixing that problem.
It was interesting listening to Christopher Luxon's speech in the House this afternoon, and he spent quite a lot of it focused on the Labour Party and the Greens to some extent. You know, that's the way it goes with these things. But he said to the Labour Party, meanwhile, businesses are terrified at the prospect of you coming in and imposing a capital gains tax. It's interesting because the people I talk to, the same people who are really keen on this accelerating the depreciation stuff, are also, most of them, these are the people I'm talking to, pretty keen on a capital gains tax to address that other part as far as the property incentives are concerned. So we'll see whether or not that argument is shifting, or whether I just have a particular group of people I'm talking to. Moving on to this, the other stuff that was foregrounded and that will affect a huge number of people are the changes to KiwiSaver on one hand and Best Start on the other. What's the overall impact of those? We're seeing KiwiSaver, the government contributions cut in half from, lots of people will know that number, $521, which is the top number you can get if you put in that amount too from the government. That's going to be cut to $260-ish. And then if you earn over $180,000 a year, then that's going to go all together. So it's sort of a little bit of means testing, which is obviously territory that's often been a hot potato as far as anything relating to retirement savings has been. Do you think that seems like a change that will affect some people to a certain extent? Meanwhile, the Best Start has been testing applied across all 3 years. What's the kind of cumulative impact of those changes?
Well, if you looked at the broad sweep of the various nips and tucks in this budget, they hurt young people, they hurt people who are unemployed, they hurt young people who are saving, but they give benefits to old people, particularly pensioners, who already own homes. So, for example, there is this tightening of the eligibility requirements for 17 and 18-year-olds who are applying for job seeker, i.e. unemployed people. They're going to have to ask nicely to their parents, or at least MSD is going to ask their parents, are you going to look after these 17 and 18-year-olds? And you better bloody, because we're not going to pay job seeker. Secondly, Best Start and the changes in various thresholds and repayment rates for working for families is going to mean that some young families, net, are going to be worse off because of these changes. And New Zealand First managed to wangle for the 66,000 holders of gold cards that they will have an increased rates rebate on the homes that they own. So, and the other thing, just broadly, the government's argument here for a tight government spending track is that this is all about reducing interest rates in the long run. If we can reduce government borrowing and we can reduce the size of government, this reduces pressure on the financial system and means that interest rates can be lower than they otherwise would be. And Nicola Willis pointed out some Treasury research which said that by the end of the forecast period, 2028-29, interest rates will be 30 basis points, so a third of a percentage point lower with this new tighter budget setting than would otherwise have been the case. So what she is saying is that Borrowers, people who already own homes and have mortgages, they will be 30 basis points better off. Now, that's great if you own a home. If you're a renter, you don't benefit from that. And typically those people who have mortgages and own homes tend to be older already because it's very difficult for young people to get into their own homes. Yet it's young people who are going to miss out on this $250 a year or so that the government's not going to put in. And if they happen to be on a high income but don't own a home, they're not even going to get that. And if they're unemployed, 18 to 19, they're going to need support from their parents. They can't apply for the unemployment benefit on their own. And if they happen to have a young child and they were previously applying for Best Start, then that's also problematic. So again, broad sweep here is less for young, poor, unemployed renters, more for home-owning pensioners.
With one exception, the 16 and 17-year-olds who are now getting the government contributions in KiwiSaver. So the hardworking 16 and 17-year-olds getting that $260 top-up if they put in. In terms of that overall shape of the budget, though, Labor has, in one of their responses, called it an austerity budget. That's not right, though, is it? When you look at the overall spending, to call it an austerity budget, when we think back to the examples of 1991 and the mother of all budgets, or the other more recent one in memory, which is the George Osborne austerity budget over in the UK, we're not looking at that, are we?
Well, I would argue that we are, when you take into account...
Really? You'd call this an austerity budget?
Plus last year's budget, and more importantly, what's forecast for the next 2 to 3 years, because the combined effect, the compounded effect of this continued low operating allowance, when you have population growth and when you have higher costs of looking after an aging population and also a sicker population, and having to make up for decades of underinvestment, what you're actually seeing is, real cuts in real frontline services spending. And a good example of this is at the very last minute, the food banks in Auckland made a plea for some funding, and all they're going to get is 1 year's worth. We're also seeing for Māori housing a real hammering. So there was upwards of $500 million in a fund for Māori housing capital to be invested in new housing, $300 million in operational funding for new Māori housing, and $50 million in operational funding through the Ministry for Māori Development, which was going into housing. That has all been cut. So more than $1 billion has been carved out of capital and operational funding for new Māori housing in this budget. And when you take into account the effects of spending in health and education, where you are constantly putting a sinking lid on something. I know a sinking lid doesn't sound like austerity, but when you've got population growth and inflation for the health sector at least, more like 5 to 6% rather than 2%, that will lead to really, really tough decisions in the next couple of years, and is already leading to tough decisions in many ways. I actually can't see how this generates a political support for the government, given particularly what we've seen with pay equity.
If we zoom right out and look at the big numbers, the debt track, how much has this shifted? Has it shifted from the numbers that were presented previously in last year's budget and at the December numbers that Nicola Willis produced?
Well, that's the irony here. The government has said this is all about going for growth and about reducing debt, but the debt track is now higher than it was at the half-yearly update, in that the borrowing requirements from the New Zealand Debt Management Office is $8.3 billion higher over the next 4 years than it was when we saw it at the half-yearly update in December. And that's because the size of the economy is smaller, there's less tax revenue coming in. Essentially, the government is chasing its tail here, and it is grinding and swiveling lower in there's a feedback loop here. As you reduce the size of government, you step back from the economy, there is a multiplier effect. And we know that a $1 billion reduction in the operating allowance will lead to a $500 million reduction in GDP. That means less tax revenues coming in, and that's why the government has had to increase its borrowing over the next 4 years or so by $8.3 billion, which, by the way, is not going to end the world because there is enormous demand for New Zealand government bonds, and this is the ultimate tragedy here, I think. Nicola Willis has argued these spending cuts are needed because we are close to our debt ceiling and we're close to being punished by the bond markets with higher interest rates. That is simply not true. The ratings agencies have said, yes, you can borrow more, you have a space. Treasury even said in 2019 that 90% is more like the ceiling. And they chose to be prudent and put the ceiling down to 50% of GDP. And actually, when you look at the interest costs that the government has at the moment, after you get interest payments and dividend payments through the super fund, the government's actually only spending 1.6% of its total revenues on interest costs. If you had gone to a bank and said, I'd like to borrow more to fix my house for my kids so that they're warm and dry, and the bank had said, no, we're not going to lend you any more money because your total interest costs are 1.6% of your disposable income, you'd go, what the heck? Everyone else seems to be able to borrow and be able to pay interest costs of 30, 40%. Why can't I? Now, 30 to 40% is too much for a government, but 1.6% is not. And I think this is a made-up fiscal crisis to justify a crunching down of the size of government in an ideological way.
I mean, the argument that comes back against that is that our own obsession with housing means that we've got a huge amount of private debt, right? But with leaving to one side the public debt, New Zealand has a large private debt.
Yeah, that's right. And the government is expecting that as it pulls back, the private sector will be able to go forward. Now, unlike in the 1990s and in the 2000s, when both National and Labour governments were restricting the size of government back down to 30% or under GDP, they were relying on the private sector and households to step forward. And that was possible in the 1990s and 2000s because households didn't have too much debt. Now they have debt of around about 150% of disposable income. Now they could actually borrow more because interest rates are relatively low. And the sort of shocking thing about where we are with private debt is that households are actually spending significantly less as a share of their income than they were in 2008. That's because interest rates are lower and because the Reserve Bank stepped in from 2013 onwards to stop households from leveraging up even more and stop banks from encouraging that leveraging. And so actually, if the government really wanted to force the Reserve Bank, suggest, cajole, nudge the Reserve Bank into loosening the restrictions on banks to go lending and was successful, then you would see the household sector step up with even more borrowing. But that's actually, I think, the key question for the next year and a half before the election is, will the Reserve Bank agree to the nudges, the cajoling, whatever it is, to loosen things up, to get that housing market with bits tacked on firing again, which is how we operate. Our economy cannot handle a housing market which is sputtering and doesn't understand how to operate in a market where prices are 20% below their peaks. And this is the problem for the government. I don't think they understand just how much of a housing market with bits tacked on we are.
If you were advising Nicola Willis or any finance minister on how to generate more growth in an economy with the current set of books, would you be looking to borrow more or bring in more on the revenue side, or a bit of both?
I think you have to do a fundamental reset of the incentives in our economy for saving and investment in real things. And that means taking away that huge advantage that investing in leveraged residential land currently has relative to investing in real assets. So just look at Australia. They do have a capital gains tax. Sure, it's slightly reduced for homeowners and for some rental property investors, but it's still there. And also they have a huge incentive for people to save into their super funds. It's compulsory and you get a tax break when you put your money in there. We don't have that. And so if you want to even up the playing field, you've got to change those incentives. Me personally, I would be putting in a land tax and leaving capital gains on real businesses untaxed to encourage that. And also providing some sort of incentive, extra incentive for people to put money into, be it KiwiSaver or some sort of compulsory scheme, make KiwiSaver compulsory, and also use the power of cheap borrowing that the government has to invest heavily in public infrastructure, in transport and housing and water, so that you get all of these construction firms and everyone else knowing that they're going to have work for the next 5 to 10 years, and use the Crown's balance sheet to grow the economy in a way that actually means that the debt to GDP calculation has a much larger GDP number. And so even though you may be increasing your debt, you're not increasing it faster than GDP. And with that sort of growth, then you see interest rates and foreign investors happy to invest in New Zealand. Remember, we're in a situation where a whole bunch of foreign investors are pulling their money out of the United States. And they want to put it into a government bond somewhere. And apart from the KiwiSaver funds and New Zealand Super and the other funds here in New Zealand who want to put their money into government bonds, there are trillions of dollars waiting to flood into a country that actually has some real growth aspirations and a whole bunch of savers and a whole bunch of young people, which New Zealand does.
Okay, very last question before I let you go, Bernard, but since you touched on it, that international environment, the geopolitical context more broadly, it's been acknowledged by the government that is something they're aware of. They've obviously been doing what they can to push a few buttons gently, notwithstanding the pushback from the Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. But how much do you think all of that volatility, the sort of typhoon of uncertainty that's been circling the earth has influenced the budget that we heard today?
Yeah, I think the government has doubled down on the tightness after receiving the new forecast from the Treasury, which are actually going to reduce growth by about 0.2% of GDP. And so the government actually used the dramas overseas to justify, partly, their reduction in their operating allowance. So their response to drama overseas was to say, and it's a very, clever political message, which is, times are tight, times are tough. And what do we all do when times are tough? We tighten our belts even harder. Problem, of course, is that a government is not a household. And when the government does it at the same time as everyone else, it's really hard to get economic growth overall unless you've got someone else stepping up. And at the moment, we are not seeing that from the private or household sector.
Bernard, thanks so much. This was a special mashup edition of Spinoff podcast, aka When the Facts Change, with some bits attached. Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Te Aihe Butler. As always, we'll be back on our various streams soon. Kia ora.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.